The scent of Oak Creek was a perpetual mix of damp pine and the subtle, cloying smell of regret. To anyone passing through, the town looked like a postcard of quiet ambition, but for Charles, it was a cage constructed of nostalgia and missed opportunities. On the eve of his 21st birthday, a milestone that was supposed to signal freedom, Charles felt utterly stuck. His acceptance letters to universities across the state were tacked above his desk, mocking him with the promise of a future he suspected would be just as empty as the present. His immediate past was a ghost he couldn't shake: Jesse, his former best friend, his first and most enduring crush, who had moved away 3 years ago and taken Charles's ability to truly connect with anyone else with him. Charles had attempted to breach the small town's lonely defenses through dating apps, but the encounters were uniformly shallow, transactional, and exhausting. "I hate it here," he'd confessed to his older sister, Clara, just last month, dragging a hand through his hair. "Everyone on the apps is either a bot or someone who just wants to hook up and disappear. They want a body for the night, not a person for life. I'll never find anyone who actually sees me before I leave for campus." Clara, protective and perceptive, had listened. She knew Charles's heartbreak wasn't about the lack of available partners, but the glaring absence of the only partner who mattered. Charles needed more than a dating fix. He needed a miracle. And Clara, Charles's mother and father, decided to deliver one, gift-wrapped. The moment Charles was summoned to the living room on his birthday, he knew something was different. His parents and Clara stood with matching conspiratorial smiles beside a box large enough to hold a refrigerator. Charles's hands trembled with curiosity and a growing sense of disbelief as he tore away the heavy wrapping paper. When he opened the box, there was no object, no appliance, and no joke. There was a person, Jesse, holding a massive decorative bow with a sheepish, blindingly familiar smile. "Happy birthday, Chuck," Jesse chuckled, stepping out and pulling Charles into a hug that smelled exactly like he remembered: cinnamon and a hint of something clean and woodsy. Charles's brain short-circuited. What are you doing here?" Clara beamed, placing a hand on Charles's shoulder. "Since you were so depressed about finding someone genuine in this town, we figured we'd skip the dating apps and just bring you the best person we know. We flew Jesse in. And that's not all. You two are going on a 3-day trip to the coast. Think of it as a pre-campus send-off."
The 3 days were pure magic. The cabin, nestled among twisted driftwood and seagrass, felt like a private world, isolated and perfect. They spent the first day talking, catching up on 3 years of missed stories, sitting on the porch swing as the sea breeze cooled their skin. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in fiery oranges and soft purples, they walked the beach. Jesse, true to habit, ran his fingers along the jagged edges of seashells, deep in thought. Charles found himself unable to look away from Jesse's profile, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the subtle flecks of muscles in his arm. They sat on a smooth, wave-worn log, Jesse casually draping an arm around Charles's shoulders, pulling him into a light, comfortable cuddle as they watched the horizon swallow the sun. The silence between them was thick with unspoken history and burgeoning new feelings. On the second day, after a morning hike that left them both flushed and invigorated, they decided a quick dip in the freezing ocean was a rite of passage. They stripped down to their swim trunks on the secluded beach. Jesse emerged from the water first, droplets clinging to his sun-kissed skin, his chest bare and defined, a sight that stole Charles's breath. Charles felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the sun. They dried off slowly, side by side, a new, charged awareness humming between them. Later, they tried cooking dinner, resulting in a smoke alarm concert and burnt pasta. They ended up laughing so hard they had to sit down on the kitchen floor, eating lukewarm ramen instead. That night, huddled close on the small sofa, watching a terrible old movie, Jesse's bare arm brushed Charles's. The contact sent a jolt through Charles. He slowly, tentatively linked their fingers. Jesse squeezed back, turning his head just slightly to meet Charles's gaze, the movie's blue light reflecting the unspoken question in their eyes. The warmth of Jesse's hand in his was a comfort Charles hadn't realized he'd been starving for. On the last night, they built a crackling fire outside, the flames dancing hypnotically. The conversation drifted toward the future. Charles talked about his anxiety over leaving Oak Creek. Jesse talked about his hope for his own literature studies. The air grew chilly, and Jesse, without a word, pulled Charles closer, wrapping an arm around his waist, their sides pressed together for warmth. Charles leaned his head onto Jesse's shoulder, feeling the solid strength beneath him. It felt so natural, so right, so much like coming home. As the fire dwindled to embers, Charles confessed, his voice barely a whisper, "I never really looked for anyone serious here after you left. No one measured up. I thought I'd never find that kind of connection again, or even for the first time." Jesse turned to Charles, his face half-shadowed by the dying firelight, his expression serious and tender. "Chuck, seeing you again, having these quiet moments, this us," he gestured vaguely between them. "It's like a missing piece finally clicked back into place. I realized how much I missed you. Not just my best friend, more, if you'll let me be more." Charles didn't wait. He leaned in and kissed him. It was a kiss full of pent-up longing, relief, and the sweet, dizzying realization that maybe, just maybe, his life was finally starting. It was slow and soft, tasting of sea salt and smoke, of promises whispered in the dark, and the beginning of everything they both had secretly longed for. They returned to Oak Creek, officially dating, their relationship a burst of sunlight in Charles's life.
The 2 months that followed were an uninterrupted stretch of blissful certainty. Jesse, who was still attending community college classes, spent every free moment with Charles. They settled into a beautiful routine built on their shared history. Late-night drives to their old high school haunt, cooking, slightly less disastrous, dinners at Charles's house, and marathon movie nights that always ended with them tangled up on the sofa, talking softly about everything and nothing. Jesse had a way of looking at Charles that stripped away all his anxieties and made him feel utterly worthy of love, the kind of genuine, wholehearted connection Charles had dreamed of. The physical intimacy they started building was just as easy and natural as their friendship had been. Simple things, like Jesse's hand resting on Charles's thigh while driving, or falling asleep with Jesse's breath warm against his neck, were intoxicating. They were living in a perfect small-town bubble, making plans for visiting each other on weekends once Charles started university nearby. They spoke of the future not with fear, but with shared excitement, believing they had finally found their permanent anchor in each other. But then the letter arrived. It was a thick envelope embossed with a prestigious coat of arms that felt impossibly ancient and important. Charles had almost forgotten he'd applied in a moment of reckless ambition a year ago. Charles was accepted to Oxford University. His excitement was immediately choked by a crushing wave of guilt. "I can't go," he told Jesse, handing him the thick envelope, his voice tight with panic. "It's too far. We just started. We had plans here." Jesse took his hand, his expression a mix of awe and resolve. "You have to go, Chuck. This is Oxford. We'll figure it out. We're great at figuring things out." With Charles's departure fixed and fast approaching, Jesse started feeling the heavy weight of the inevitable distance. He decided he needed to be realistic about his own life in Oak Creek. If Charles was leaving, maybe Jesse needed to try and build something for himself. He reluctantly downloaded the dating apps Charles had so vehemently cursed. The dates that followed were a depressing carbon copy of Charles's experience. There was the guy who treated the date like a job interview, and the next who, 10 minutes into meeting, suggested they skip the coffee and go straight to his place. Jesse quickly realized that the people in their town weren't looking for a person for life. They were looking for a temporary escape. Every awkward conversation and shallow proposition
only intensified the agonizing reality. The genuine, profound connection he had with Charles was unique, and leaving it behind felt like a physical wrench. He deleted the apps after a week, dedicating his final few weeks fully to Charles. The tearful goodbye at the airport was agonizing, but they held on to the promise of video calls and nightly messages. For a few months it worked. Charles explored ancient libraries and cobbled streets, sending Jesse photos of the stunning architecture. Jesse was there on his screen, sharing stories from his community college classes and their favorite coffee shop. But the time difference, 6 unforgiving hours, was a cruel, relentless third party in their relationship. Charles was either settling into a late-night study session or trying to squeeze in a quick call before class began at 9 a.m. Oxford time. Jesse, meanwhile, was often just waking up or finishing a long day. Their conversations became rushed, punctuated by dropped calls and scheduling conflicts, the joy slowly bleeding into exhaustion and frustration. "I called last night, but you were already asleep," Charles would sigh, frustrated. "I know, I'm sorry," Jesse would reply, equally defeated. "I'd stay up, but I can't function on 2 hours of sleep just to talk for 10 minutes. The passion they shared in person began to fade into logistical frustration. The physical intimacy they had built became a longing ache that a shaky video call couldn't satisfy. Jesse admitted one night, his voice hollow over the line, "I just don't feel like I know you anymore. It's all quick updates and I miss yous. I feel like I'm dating your voicemail." The inevitable happened 2 weeks later. It was a mutual, heartbreaking decision. They still loved each other, but the distance and the conflicting schedules were slowly suffocating their happiness. They agreed to break up, promising to remain friends, a vow Charles knew they couldn't possibly keep, not yet. He hung up the phone and buried his face in his hands, feeling the weight of Oxford and the crushing emptiness of a future he had achieved at the cost of his heart.
In the wake of the breakup, Charles had hoped that the excitement of being at Oxford would fill the void, perhaps even lead to a new connection. He tried dating again, wading into the notoriously cynical waters of student hookup culture. But the scene in Oxford was even worse than Oak Creek, trading small-town boredom for intellectual snobbery mixed with emotional detachment. The men he met were often shockingly transactional. There was the philosophy student who only wanted to discuss complex ethical frameworks during sex. The guy with whom he shared a pleasant drink only to be called too emotional and excessively romantic when he suggested a second date focused on connection rather than conquest. The worst was Marcus. They had gone out twice, and Charles, starved for kindness, had allowed himself a flicker of hope. But after their second date, Marcus invited Charles back to his room, and when Charles woke up the next morning, his wallet and his phone were gone. The humiliation of being robbed by someone he had tentatively trusted, combined with the sting of realizing he was desperate enough to fall for a scam, left him feeling utterly debased. He had traded a real, beautiful love for this miserable charade. The ancient, scholarly city that promised so much inspiration felt crushingly lonely. The libraries and lecture halls were a welcome distraction, but every night he returned to his single room, the absence of Jesse felt like a physical ache. Charles returned to Oak Creek for the Christmas break, a shell of his former self. He was determined, however, not to give in to complete misery. He knew he couldn't hide in his room for the whole break. Missing the smell of hay and leather from his childhood riding lessons, Charles found work mucking stalls at a local stable. It was here he met Wesley, a handsome, laconic cowboy with sun-baked skin and eyes the color of faded denim. Wesley was kind, rugged, and unlike anyone Charles had met at Oxford. They started hanging out after their shifts, sharing whiskey and quiet conversations under the vast, cold Oak Creek sky. For 2 weeks, Charles allowed himself to feel a cautious, tiny warmth.
Wesley was physically affectionate, and Charles felt a fragile hope that he might be ready to move on, ready to accept something new, something easy. He started to believe that maybe the heartbreak with Jessie was just a stepping stone to a simpler love. Then, one frigid afternoon, Charles walked into the main barn to fetch a halter. The stables were quiet. As he rounded a stack of hay bales, he froze. There, sprawled in the straw, was Wesley, and a woman Charles vaguely recognized as a ranch hand named Arizona. They were oblivious, caught up in a passionate, hurried act. Charles didn't say a word. He simply backed away, the halter dropping silently into the dust. The discovery was a punch to the gut. It wasn't the cheating that stung most. It was the total erasure of the sweet, shared moments he thought were meaningful. Wesley hadn't seen him. Wesley had just seen an easy distraction. That was it. Charles went straight home, locked his door, and succumbed to the absolute conviction that he was utterly incapable of finding genuine love. He was destined for loneliness, doomed to be discarded. His parents and Clara found him in that state, morose, isolated, and completely devoid of hope. Clara remembered his old complaints, now horribly validated by both Oxford and the cowboy. She knew Charles needed more than just kind words. He needed a radical intervention.
On Christmas Eve, the doorbell rang. Charles assumed it was another relative, but his mother insisted he answer it. He opened the door, and there stood Jessie, eyes red-rimmed but smiling nervously. "Merry Christmas, Chuck," Jessie whispered. "Jessie, Charles started, his voice choked with grief and surprise, remembering their painful breakup just weeks prior. "Wait," Jessie interrupted, his tenderness overriding the anxiety. He pulled a thick envelope, suspiciously similar to the one Charles had received months ago, from his jacket pocket. "Your family, they're intense. When they heard how sad we both were, they didn't just fly me out. Clara called me." Jessie's voice dropped with a mix of awe and amusement. "She called, basically ordered me to apply, and then used every contact she had. She connected me with a professor at Oxford who knew her former boss, some incredibly intricate small-town meets global network scheme. She helped me craft a late application and then coached me through an emergency video interview." Jessie stepped forward, closing the distance Charles had felt for months. "I had to do it. After we broke up, I tried dating here too, just to be realistic. But everyone was exactly what you warned me about. They were empty. I realized I can't let fear or distance make me lose the best thing that's ever happened to me." He held up the formal letterhead, crisp and prestigious. "Clara told me, if Charles can't be happy without you, then you two need to figure out how to be together. And I am sick of hearing him complain about those awful dating apps." Charles's eyes scanned the words on the letter. Jessie had been accepted to Oxford University on a full scholarship for his chosen field of literature. "Jessie, how?" Charles managed, tears finally welling up and spilling over. "It was a mad scramble, but it worked," Jessie laughed, wiping a tear from his own cheek. "I'm not doing this just for you, Chuck. I'm doing this for me. We're going to make this work, in the same city, with no time difference." Charles pulled Jessie into a hug so tight it was almost painful, relief and love washing over him in a warm, desperate wave. It was a kiss that redeemed every failed date, every tear, and every agonizing mile of distance. He had come home broken, emotionally raw, and prepared to give up on love entirely, but his family's incredible, slightly manipulative, gift-giving spirit had mended him entirely. He wouldn't just be going back to Oxford in the new year. He would be taking his whole heart with him. The reunion on Christmas Eve was the true starting line of their life together. When Charles and Jessie returned to Oxford in the new year, the ancient, daunting city transformed into a sanctuary built for two. Life was still demanding. Oxford's academic rigor didn't vanish, but the presence of the other made everything manageable. They lived in separate but neighboring student accommodations, their routines finally aligned. No more missed calls or 6-hour time difference. Now it was shared meals in the common dining hall, late-night study sessions side by side in the Bodleian Library, and the simple joy of falling asleep together without the aid of a grainy screen. Their romance deepened into a powerful, unbreakable bond. They navigated the complexity of their degrees, the occasional spat over a misplaced textbook, and the stress of final exams, always emerging stronger. Jessie's presence had been the missing anchor that Charles needed to thrive, making his academic achievements feel earned and worthwhile. After graduation, they didn't rush back to Oak Creek. Instead, they built a life in the UK for several years. Charles worked in historical preservation, and Jessie became a successful writer and editor, his prose reflecting the deeply human connections he valued so highly. They exchanged vows in a quiet ceremony in a small English garden, Jessie wearing a suit the color of a stormy sea, and Charles in classic charcoal. Their love a testament to the fact that fate, with a little help from a meddling family, always finds a way. The call of home, however, was persistent. They eventually settled near Oak Creek, close enough to visit their aging parents, but far enough to have their own space. They purchased a beautiful, rambling piece of land and built a stunning, rustic ranch house. They called it Summer Oak, a tribute to their hometown and the feeling of warmth and stability they now shared. Jessie still loved the feel of manual labor, and Charles loved watching him work. Their ranch was their private oasis, often becoming the scene of the intimate, relaxed moments that had characterized their cabin trip years before. On sweltering summer afternoons, after hours spent fixing fences or tending to the small herd of rescue horses they kept, they would inevitably end up cooling off. Shirtless, sun-baked, and exhausted, they would sit on the porch swing, the strong scent of pine and horse leather replacing the cologne of the city, stealing sweet kisses that were far more satisfying than any transactional date Charles had ever endured. A few years later, they adopted 2 children, a vibrant girl named Claire and a thoughtful boy named Eli. Their home filled the noise of laughter, homework, and scraped knees. Charles and Jessie watched their children grow, knowing that the greatest gift they had ever received was not the trip to the coast, but the audacious push from Clara that had forced them to pursue their real, beautiful, permanent love. They had been given an Oxford ticket, but they had built a whole world.